In a federal courtroom yesterday, a 62-year-old defendant physically collapsed after receiving guilty verdicts on all 47 counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The incident occurred as the presiding judge concluded reading the verdicts and immediately imposed the maximum allowable sentence of 40 years in federal prison. Court observers reported that the defendant's physical reaction intensified progressively throughout the verdict reading. Initially standing at the defense table, with his hands gripping the edge, the defendant's condition deteriorated as each guilty verdict was announced. Medical professionals later identified his response as an acute stress reaction, a documented physiological response to extreme psychological pressure. The case centered on allegations that the defendant operated a Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of over $200 million. The 8-week trial included extensive testimony from victims, financial experts, and forensic accountants. Prosecutors presented comprehensive evidence demonstrating that investor funds were not used as promised, but were instead diverted for personal expenditures. The defense strategy attempted to characterize the defendant's actions as mismanagement rather than intentional fraud. Defense attorneys argued their client lacked criminal intent and was incompetent in financial matters rather than deliberately deceptive. However, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on every count presented. The unanimous decision reflected what prosecutors described as overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud spanning multiple years and affecting hundreds of individual investors across several states. The defendant's physical deterioration became increasingly apparent as the judge methodically read through each count. Beginning with the first few verdicts, observers noted subtle changes in his demeanor and physical stability. His breathing pattern shifted noticeably, becoming more rapid and shallow as the reading progressed. By the 10th guilty verdict, visible tremors were apparent in the defendant's hands as they pressed against the courtroom table. The trembling intensified progressively, extending from his hands to his arms and shoulders. Court personnel positioned nearby could hear the sound of his hands tapping involuntarily against the wooden surface. As the judge reached the 30th count, the defendant's entire upper body exhibited visible shaking. His attorneys, standing beside him, attempted to provide physical support. One placed a stabilizing hand on his back as his posture began to waver. Perspiration became visible on his face and neck, and his shirt collar darkened with sweat. By count 40, the defendant's legs were visibly unstable. He shifted his weight repeatedly, and his knees appeared to buckle momentarily before he regained his stance. His breathing had become audible throughout the courtroom, characterized by rapid, shallow gasps consistent with hyperventilation. When the judge announced the final guilty verdict on count 47 and immediately added that the court would impose the maximum sentence of 40 years, the defendant's legs collapsed entirely. He fell directly downward, striking the floor with considerable force. Federal marshals and paramedics responded immediately, and the courtroom was cleared of spectators while medical personnel assessed his condition. Paramedics who responded to the courtroom confirmed the defendant was conscious but disoriented. His vital signs showed an elevated pulse and significantly elevated blood pressure, consistent with an acute stress response. Medical personnel checked for head trauma from the fall and recommended hospital transport for comprehensive evaluation. Before the defendant was removed from the courtroom, the presiding judge made a formal ruling regarding the validity of the sentencing. She stated for the court record that the 40-year sentence had been properly imposed while the defendant was present and conscious. Federal rules of criminal procedure require defendants to be present during sentencing, and the judge determined this requirement had been satisfied before the defendant lost consciousness. The defendant was transported by stretcher to a nearby hospital for evaluation. Following medical clearance, he was transferred to federal custody to await designation to a federal correctional facility. Medical experts later explained that the defendant's collapse resulted from his nervous system being overwhelmed by stress hormones, primarily adrenaline and cortisol, triggering a fight-or-flight response with no available outlet. The sudden announcement of the maximum sentence combined with the cumulative stress of 47 consecutive guilty verdicts, caused a rapid spike and subsequent crash in blood pressure, resulting in loss of consciousness. Such physiological responses to extreme stress are documented in medical literature and have been observed in courtroom settings when defendants receive severe sentences. The medical assessment concluded the defendant's reaction, while dramatic, followed recognized patterns of acute psychological trauma manifesting as physical symptoms. The case centered on a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that operated for approximately 7 years before federal investigators uncovered the fraud. According to prosecutors, the defendant solicited investments by promising returns of 12 to 15% annually, claiming funds would be invested in commercial real estate ventures and secured loan portfolios. Instead, investigators found that minimal legitimate investing occurred. The defendant used incoming investor funds to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion of profitable operations. Simultaneously, he diverted millions of dollars for personal use, including purchasing luxury vehicles, vacation properties, and funding an extravagant lifestyle inconsistent with his actual financial position. Federal forensic accountants traced the movement of investor funds through multiple accounts and shell companies. Their analysis revealed a pattern of deception spanning 47 distinct criminal acts, each constituting a separate count in the indictment. The evidence included detailed financial records, email communications, falsified investment statements, and testimony from banking officials. During the trial, prosecutors presented testimony from more than 30 victims whose lives were significantly impacted by the fraud. Many were retirees who invested their life savings based on the defendant's representations. Others included middle-class families who diverted college savings or emergency funds into what they believed were secure, professionally managed investments. The total documented losses exceeded $200 million, though investigators believe the actual figure may be higher due to victims who have not come forward. Expert witnesses explained the mechanics of Ponzi schemes and demonstrated how the defendant's operation followed classic patterns of such frauds. Among the most compelling testimony came from victims whose financial security was destroyed by the fraud. A 78-year-old retired teacher testified that she lost her entire retirement savings of approximately $340,000, money she had accumulated over 40 years of work. Following the loss, she was forced to move in with her daughter and accept part-time employment at a grocery store to afford prescription medications. Another victim, a married couple in their 50s, described losing $80,000 they had saved over 15 years for their son's college education. The fund's disappearance forced their son to decline admission to his preferred university and attend a less expensive community college instead. The emotional testimony highlighted how financial fraud extends beyond monetary loss to affect educational opportunities, family relationships, and life trajectories. Additional victims included a disabled veteran who lost funds set aside for medical care, a widow who invested her late husband's life insurance proceeds, and several small business owners who invested operating capital they could not afford to lose. Many victims described the psychological trauma of discovering the fraud, the shame of realizing they had been deceived, and the ongoing financial hardship resulting from the losses. Prosecutors emphasized that the defendant's actions demonstrated sophisticated planning and deliberate deception rather than simple mismanagement. Evidence showed he created false documents, provided fabricated account statements, and actively concealed the scheme's collapse, even as he continued soliciting new investments. Throughout the trial, the defendant maintained his innocence, testifying that he believed the investments would eventually recover and that he never intended to harm anyone. The jury's verdict rejected this characterization entirely. Federal sentencing guidelines recommended a range of 20 to 25 years imprisonment based on the conviction counts, financial losses, and victim impact. However, the presiding judge determined that an upward departure from the guidelines was warranted due to several aggravating factors. In her sentencing statement, the judge cited the extraordinary scope of the fraud, the vulnerability of many victims, the defendant's complete lack of remorse throughout the proceedings and his decision to testify falsely at trial. She noted that the defendant had shown no acknowledgement of wrongdoing and had attempted to shift blame to business partners and market conditions. The judge observed that the defendant's actions had devastated hundreds of families and that the $200 million loss represented not just abstract financial damage, but real human suffering. She referenced specific victim testimony, including the elderly woman forced to return to work and the family whose son's educational opportunities were limited by the fraud. The maximum sentence of 40 years represents the statutory ceiling for the combined counts. At 62 years old, the defendant would be over 100 years old at the theoretical completion of this sentence. Even with the standard 15% reduction available in the federal system for good conduct, he would serve approximately 34 years and be 96 years old upon release. The judge acknowledged the severity of the sentence, but stated that the magnitude of the harm warranted the maximum penalty available under law. She emphasized that the sentence should reflect not only punishment, but also deterrence, sending a message that large-scale financial fraud carries serious consequences. Legal experts anticipate the defendant will appeal the sentence through the federal appellate system. Expected arguments will likely challenge the sentence as excessive, potentially arguing it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment given the defendant's age and the effective life sentence it represents. Defense attorneys may contend the district court judge abused her discretion by imposing the statutory maximum rather than a sentence within the guideline range. They may also argue that certain trial procedures were flawed or that evidence was improperly admitted. However, legal analysts note that appellate courts grant substantial deference to trial judges in sentencing matters, particularly in cases involving large-scale fraud with extensive victim impact. The federal appeals process typically takes 18 to 24 months for initial appellate review, with possibilities for further appeal to higher courts if the initial appeal is unsuccessful. During this period, the defendant will remain in federal custody, serving his sentence while the legal process continues. The case highlights ongoing concerns about financial fraud targeting unsophisticated investors and retirees. Federal prosecutors have emphasized their commitment to pursuing white-collar crime cases aggressively, particularly schemes that target vulnerable populations. The Securities and Exchange Commission and other regulatory agencies have increased scrutiny of investment operations following several high-profile fraud cases in recent years. Victims' advocates note that while the criminal prosecution provides accountability, many victims will never recover their financial losses. Restitution orders are standard in federal fraud cases, but defendants often lack assets to satisfy such orders after legal fees and asset forfeiture. The defendant's lengthy incarceration further reduces any realistic possibility of victims recovering their losses through civil remedies.